Hello everyone, and welcome back to our channel, the place where we believe that within every quiet life, there's a powerful story of strength waiting to be told. Before we dive into today's story, if you find value and inspiration in these explorations of the human spirit, we'd be so grateful if you took just a moment to give this video a like, share it with someone who might need a story like this today, and of course, subscribe to our channel. Hitting that notification bell ensures you'll never miss out on our next story about overcoming adversity and finding true dignity. Your support helps us continue to bring these important narratives to light. Alright, let's begin. Today, we have a story that asks a very powerful question. What happens when quiet, undeniable competence runs into loud, unearned arrogance? It's a story about knowing your worth, even when the world is telling you to know your place. You know, people think the loudest place in a small town is the local diner on a Friday night, or the high school football stadium under the lights. They're wrong. The loudest place I've ever known was the dead silence in the office of Walker & Sons Construction. A silence that judged you the second you walked through the door. I remember my first day like it was yesterday. The air, thick with the smell of sawdust, old coffee, and a brand of masculine pride that had been passed down through generations, felt heavy in my lungs. This was Walker territory. Everyone in Cedar Creek, Oregon, knew that. Frank Walker, the man whose name was on the sign, was a local legend. He was built like the oak trees that surrounded our town, sturdy, weathered, and unmoving. He looked at my resume, then at me, and I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. It wasn't interest. It was confusion, like he was trying to figure out how a puzzle piece from a completely different box ended up on his table. My resume had a single glaring line on it: Massachusetts Institute of Technology, incomplete. To a man like Frank, who built his empire with calloused hands and grit, that probably sounded like a fancy way of saying, quitter. We don't get many folks with your ... background applying for an admin job, he'd said, his voice a low rumble. This is a place for hard work, not fancy theories. I just nodded, giving him the simple, reassuring smile I'd perfected. I'm a hard worker, Mr. Walker. He didn't smile back, but the real test wasn't Frank, it was his son, Caleb. Caleb was everything his father was, but without the foundation of hard-earned respect. He wore the family name like an expensive watch, flashy and meant to be seen. He walked into the office on my third day, tossing a set of rolled-up blueprints onto my desk with a thud that made me jump. He didn't even look at me. He was talking to Gus, the old foreman. A quiet man with kind eyes who was the only person who'd greeted me with a genuine "morning, Maya," instead of a suspicious stare. This old mill project is a damn nightmare, Gus, Caleb said, completely ignoring my existence. Dad's bleeding money trying to save that pile of splinters. The old mill wasn't just a project. It was Frank Walker's obsession, the one thing his own legendary father had failed to restore. It was a beautiful, crumbling piece of town history, and its main support structure was failing in ways none of their engineers could figure out. It was the skeleton in the Walker family closet. I knew all this, of course. I'd spent 2 nights in the town library before my interview, studying the mill's original plans. Caleb finally turned to me, a smirk playing on his lips. You, Maya, just keep the coffee hot and the paperwork filed, sweetheart. Leave the thinking to the men who know their way around a 2x4. He winked at Gus, expecting him to chuckle along. But Gus just looked down at the floor, a silent act of disapproval that I was grateful for. My face felt hot. In my mind, I was running complex load-bearing calculations, picturing the exact point of rotational stress on the mill's northern truss, a flaw I'd spotted on the plans almost immediately. But on the outside, I just gave him that same practiced smile. Yes, of course. I thought that would be the end of it. I thought I could just be the quiet girl in the corner, cashing a paycheck and enjoying the peace of the Oregon pines after the concrete chaos of Cambridge. I needed the quiet. I needed to be invisible for a while. But that night, long after the heavy boots had gone home and the only sound was the hum of the old fluorescent lights, I found myself standing in front of the blueprints Caleb had left on his desk. The Walker legacy, the town's history, the impossible problem. It was all laid out in stark black and white. And as I stared at the intricate lines and faded measurements, a feeling I hadn't allowed myself to feel in over 2 years began to stir in my chest. It wasn't anger. It was the thrill of a challenge. In the quiet of that empty office, surrounded by the ghosts of Walker men, I finally saw it. Not just the problem they were all blind to. I saw the answer. An answer they would never, in a million years, believe could come from me. So there I was, caught in this strange limbo. Every instinct I had, every lesson my own father had taught me about respecting the craft. He was a cabinet maker, a man who believed wood had a soul, and that you had to listen to it, was screaming at me to do something. But my gut, the part of me that had fled the cutthroat world of academia for a reason, told me to stay hidden. I couldn't just walk up to Frank Walker and say, "Sir, your son is about to sink your entire legacy because he can't read a blueprint properly." I'd be laughed out of town before I finished the sentence, so I decided on a third option. If they wouldn't see me, they would see my work. I would become a ghost. That first night, my heart was hammering against my ribs. I waited until the last truck rumbled out of the parking lot, until the only light was the cold, sterile glow from the office fixtures. I walked over to the main drafting table, the massive sheet of paper holding the old mill plans looking like a patient on an operating table. I took a sticky note from my desk. With a pencil, I didn't just write a suggestion. I drew a perfectly scaled microdiagram of a gusset plate modification, adding precise calculations for load redistribution. It was elegant, simple, and it would solve the immediate issue with the northern truss. I stuck the little yellow square right over the flawed section and slipped out of the office like a thief. The next morning was agony. I sat at my desk, pretending to sort invoices, but my eyes were glued to the reflection in my dark computer screen, watching the main office behind me. I saw Caleb stroll in, grab a mug of coffee, and wander over to the plans. He saw the note. I watched him peel it off, a frown of annoyance on his face. He stared at it for a long, silent moment. I expected him to crumple it up, to toss it away as a prank, but he didn't. I saw the gears turning behind his eyes. He wasn't trying to figure out who wrote it. He was figuring out how to use it. He quickly glanced around the office, his eyes passing right over me as if I were a piece of furniture, and then he slipped the note into his pocket. An hour later, I overheard it, the moment that made my stomach turn. He was in Frank's office, the door slightly ajar. "Dad, I was up half the night wrestling with that truss issue," Caleb said, his voice full of false modesty. Then it hit me. We've been over-engineering it. What if we just use a modified gusset plate to redistribute the load? The silence from Frank's office was deafening. Then, for the first time in weeks, I heard Frank Walker actually laugh. It was a short, relieved bark. "A gusset plate ... Son of a gun, Caleb. That's a damn good idea. Simple. Smart. That's a Walker solution." My hands clenched under my desk. A Walker solution? It was an engineering solution. It was my solution. Watching Caleb walk out of that office with a proud slap on the back from his father felt worse than his insults. An insult is just words. This was theft. He was stealing my thoughts, my education, my very essence, and wearing it like his own work jacket. It became a twisted routine. Every couple of nights, I'd leave another ghost note. A new chemical compound for treating the water-damaged wood. A different technique for anchoring new supports into the old foundation. And every time, Caleb would absorb the credit, his confidence growing more obnoxious with each passing day. The project started to crawl forward, and the crew started to see Caleb as some kind of reluctant genius. But one person wasn't fooled. Gus, the old foreman, started watching me. Not in a creepy way. In a quiet, knowing way. One morning, I came in to find a brand new, professional-grade drafting pencil lying right next to my keyboard. Not a cheap one from the supply closet, but a German-made one that engineers covet. There was no note. There didn't need to be. Later. That day, he walked past my desk as I was pouring coffee. "You know," he said, not breaking his stride, "whoever's been leaving those little breadcrumbs for Caleb, they got a good head on their shoulders, a real good head." He never looked at me, but I knew he was talking to me. It was a lifeline, a tiny thread of recognition in a sea of willful ignorance. But it also made me realize the danger of the game I was playing. Caleb was getting praised for patching the cracks, for putting band-aids on a broken bone. But I could see the whole foundation was about to give way, that there was a fundamental flaw he couldn't even comprehend. And his stolen confidence, this unearned arrogance Frank was praising him for, was going to be the very thing that buried them all. You know that feeling in the air right before a big thunderstorm? The sky gets a weird, heavy color, the birds go quiet, and you can just feel the pressure drop. That's what it felt like at Walker & Sons for 2 solid weeks. Caleb's stolen solutions were working, I guess, in the way that duct tape can hold a leaking pipe together for a little while. The project was moving, Frank was smiling a little more, and Caleb was walking around like he'd personally invented the hammer. But the whole time, I had this knot in my stomach that wouldn't go away. I could feel the old mill groaning under the strain. Sometimes when the office was quiet, I swear I could hear the faint, high-pitched sigh of stressed wood. It was a sound. No one else seemed to notice, but for me, it was like a scream. Then, the inevitable happened. A young worker up on the scaffolding, a kid named Tim, saw it first. A long, jagged crack running down the side of the B5 beam. One of the primary load-bearing supports for the entire second floor. It wasn't a surface crack. It was a deep, structural wound. Panic is a funny thing on a construction site. It moves fast and it's contagious. The work stopped. Men stood around, looking up at the beam, their hands on their hips, a low murmur rippling through them. This wasn't a simple problem. This was a shut-it-all-down kind of problem. And to make matters worse, I knew from filing the paperwork that the county inspector, a notoriously tough old guy named Henderson, was scheduled for his quarterly walkthrough the following Tuesday. A failed inspection wouldn't just mean a delay. It would mean fines, public record of failure, and a humiliation Frank Walker's pride could never survive. The pressure in the office went from a low hum to a piercing shriek. Caleb, of course, saw it as his time to shine. He swaggered out to the site, looked at the crack, and scoffed as if the beam had personally offended him. It's fine," he announced to the worried crew. "I've got it." He remembered one of my more complicated anonymous notes, one that mentioned using tension rods to brace against lateral shear. But the thing is, he only remembered the words, the hardware. He didn't understand the physics behind it, the delicate balance of forces. He came back to the office and drew up a quick, brutish plan. They just bolt a massive half-inch thick steel plate directly onto the side of the old timber beam. It was the engineering equivalent of using a sledgehammer to perform surgery. It wouldn't fix the internal weakness. It would just hide the crack and worse, introduce a new, violent stress point between the rigid steel and the flexing, ancient wood. I watched Frank's face as Caleb presented the solution. I saw a man drowning, and his son had just thrown him. A life raft made of lead. But Frank wasn't thinking about hydrodynamics. He was just desperate to not go under. He was thinking about the inspector. He was thinking about his name. "Good," Frank said, his voice tight. "That's good, son. It's strong. Get it done." I want that thing looking like Fort Knox by the time Henderson shows up. That evening, as I was packing my bag to leave, Gus cornered me by the water cooler. He just stood there for a moment, wiping his hands on a rag, not looking at me. "That B5 beam," he said quietly, his voice raspy with sawdust. "It's old-growth fur. Got a memory longer than my grandmother. You bolt a slab of cold steel to it, that wood ain't gonna cooperate. It's gonna fight it. It's gonna twist until something gives." He paused and finally looked up, his gaze so direct it felt like it could see right through me. "Some of us know who's got the real blueprints in their head, Maya. A storm's coming. You can't just watch it happen." He walked away, leaving me standing there with my heart pounding. He wasn't just giving me a warning. He was giving me a responsibility. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat at my small kitchen table, staring at the high-end drafting pencil Gus had given me. And I could hear the voice of my favorite professor from MIT, Dr. Thorne, as clearly as if she were in the room. "A structure's silence is misleading," she used to lecture, pacing in front of the class. "Listen for the whispers of stress, of fatigue. Because an engineer who ignores the whispers is no engineer at all. They're an accessory to the collapse." Gus was right. A storm was coming. And I realized with a sickening certainty that if I stayed silent now, I wouldn't just be an observer, I'd be part of the wreckage. The next morning, I woke up before my alarm. The anger I'd felt the night before had cooled into something else, something cold and heavy and strangely calm. It was the kind of calm you feel when you know you have to do something necessary, but terrifying. I wasn't thinking about my job anymore, or about being liked. I was thinking about what Dr. Thorne said, being an accessory to collapse. I spent 2 hours before sunrise printing everything out. Thermal imaging charts showing the dangerous friction heat building between the steel and the old wood. Material fatigue projections, and a step-by-step simulation showing how the B5 beam's failure would create a cascade effect, bringing down the entire northern roof. I put it all in a simple professional black folder. It felt like an explosive device in my hands. When I got to the site, I didn't go to my desk. I walked straight through the office and out onto the main construction floor. The crew was gathered for their morning safety meeting, right under the shadow of the B5 beam. The new steel plate Caleb had installed was gleaming under the work. Lights, a shiny metal scar on the tired, old wood. My presence on the floor immediately silenced the usual morning banter. The sight of this office girl, in her sensible shoes, walking onto their turf, was so unusual that all eyes turned to me. I walked directly to Caleb, my heart a cold, steady drum against my ribs. Frank was standing right next to him. "Caleb," I said, my voice even and low, trying to keep it from shaking. "I need you to look at this. Before you let anyone work under this beam, the steel plate is causing severe compressive strain. The data shows he didn't let me finish." His face, which had been confused for a split second, turned dark with rage. It wasn't just anger. It was the panicked fury of someone who's been caught. In front of everyone, his voice boomed across the cavernous space, echoing off the high ceiling. "The data, the data." He snatched the folder out of my hands so aggressively that a few pages slipped out. "You think you can come out here with your little high school science project and tell me how to do my job?" He held the folder up like it was a dirty diaper, showing it to the silent watching crew. A couple of the younger guys loyal to him snickered. "Let me make this really clear for you," he sneered, stepping closer, his voice dripping with contempt. "You handle coffee. You handle invoices. You do not handle engineering because you know nothing about it. Now get off my site." And then he did it. The thing that I'll never forget. He didn't just dismiss me. With a final theatrical look of disgust, he opened his hand and just dropped the folder. My work, my research, my desperate attempt to prevent a disaster, all of it scattered across the dusty, boot-trodden concrete floor. The thermal images of the stressed wood landed next to a discarded cigarette butt. The cascade simulation slid under a muddy pallet. It was a complete and utter violation. The snickering stopped. The silence that followed was thick with shock and embarrassment. Most of the older guys, the ones with decades of experience in their hands, couldn't even look at me. They just suddenly found their boots incredibly interesting. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Gus. He wasn't looking at his boots. He was looking at Frank, and he just closed his eyes and slowly, almost imperceptibly, shook his head. For one wild, stupid second, I thought Frank might intervene. That the father, the businessman, would see the recklessness. But he didn't. He saw his son's authority being challenged by a secretary in front of his entire crew. He saw weakness. And a man like Frank Walker runs from weakness. He stepped forward, placing a hand on Caleb's shoulder in a clear show of solidarity. His voice was quiet, but it was colder and sharper than any shout. "Maya," he said, the name sounding like an insult. "That is enough." He paused, letting the weight of his position settle over the crowd. "Caleb is the site manager. You are an office assistant. Go back to your desk and know your place." I didn't say another word. I just turned around. I didn't stoop to pick up my scattered papers. I left them there, a monument to their ignorance. I could feel every single eye on my back as I walked away, my footsteps echoing in the humiliating silence. I got back to my little desk, the smell of stale coffee suddenly making me nauseous. My hands were shaking now, but I wasn't crying. I was past tears. A hard, clear certainty was crystallizing in my chest. He told me to know my place, and in that moment, I finally did. My place wasn't at a desk in his company. It was above it. It was time to stop playing their game by their rules. It was time to stop talking to the walkers and start talking to the people who held their fate in their hands. I picked up my phone, my fingers steady as I scrolled through my contacts. The system hadn't just bent, it had broken. And I was about to be the one to report it. Sitting at that desk, the echo of Frank's words, "Know your place," ringing in my ears. Something inside me didn't just break. It reset. The humiliation was like a forest fire that had burned away all the undergrowth of fear and self-doubt. All that was left was the bedrock, the engineer. And that engineer knew one thing with absolute certainty. The chain of command at Walker & Sons was a dead end. It was a closed loop of pride and ignorance, and I was done trying to reason with it. Arguing with Caleb was like explaining physics to a brick wall. Appealing to Frank was like asking that same wall for permission to move. No, the system wasn't broken. It was designed to protect itself, so I had to go outside the system. I had to make a call to the one person who had the power to bring the whole show to a halt. The one name that made even men like Frank Walker nervous. Dr. Aris Thorne. Even back at MIT, Dr. Thorne was a legend. They called her the Dragon of Preservation. She was the head of the State Historical Preservation Society, a woman with a PhD in structural engineering and zero tolerance for incompetence. She was brilliant, she was terrifying, and she cared more about the integrity of a 100-year-old support beam than any builder's profit margin. To contact her directly as a low-level admin over the heads of the project owners, it wasn't just a risk. In our industry, it was career suicide. You get labeled a troublemaker, a whistleblower, you become radioactive. But the thought of my name being on the paperwork, even as an assistant, when that roof came down, that was a risk I couldn't live with. That night, my tiny apartment became a war room. I didn't sleep. Fueled by 3 pots of black coffee, I took all my scattered notes, my late-night calculations, and my secret research and forged them into a weapon. This wasn't going to be a simple letter. This was going to be a professional, undeniable 30-page report. I wrote an executive summary, a detailed analysis of the cascade failure points, and a complete remediation strategy with diagrams so clear a child could understand them. I even included a preliminary budget and a revised construction timeline. It was the most thorough, most important piece of work I had done since my thesis. As the sun began to stream through my window, I printed it all out, the pages warm from the printer. It was a declaration of war, bound together with a simple staple dot. As I attached the PDF to a new email, my hand trembled. I thought about the quiet life I had tried to build here. The friendly nod from the woman at the grocery store, the simple peace of the Oregon forest. I was about to set fire to all of it. One click, and I would go from being the quiet office girl to the woman who brought down the town's most powerful family. There would be no coming back from this. But then I looked at the report's cover page, Structural Integrity Analysis of the Cedar Creek Mill. It was my name, my work, my truth. And I couldn't bury it any longer. The email itself was short and sterile, no emotion. No mention of Caleb's insults or Frank's dismissal. Just facts. Subject: urgent. Structural analysis of the Cedar Creek Mill project. Dear Dr. Thorne, my name is Maya Evans. I am currently serving in an administrative capacity on the Cedar Creek Mill restoration. I have compiled a report detailing urgent and critical concerns regarding the project's structural integrity, which I believe presents an imminent risk. The report is attached for your immediate review. Respectfully, Maya Evans. My finger hovered over the send button for what felt like an eternity. It was the final step off the cliff. I took one last deep breath and clicked. The little whoosh sound of the email disappearing into the digital ether was the loudest sound I had ever heard. It was done. There was no unsending it. I had just bypassed the king and sent a message directly to the queen. I had thrown a rock at a hornet's nest. All I could do now was wait for the swarm. The 2 days after I hit send were the longest of my life. It was a special kind of psychological torture. Every time the office phone rang, my stomach would clench. Every email notification made my heart leap into my throat. I was expecting a furious call from Frank, telling me I was fired for insubordination. I was expecting an email from Dr. Thorne, a curt dismissal telling me not to waste her time, but all I got was silence. A thick, heavy, suffocating silence. The atmosphere at Walker & Sons was arctic. Caleb wouldn't even walk on the same side of the hallway as me. Frank looked straight through me as if I were made of glass. I just kept my head down, did my work, filed the invoices, made the coffee, and waited. The quiet was worse than shouting. It was the quiet of the universe holding its breath, and I had no idea if it was about to exhale a sigh of relief or a hurricane. It happened on a Wednesday, just after 10 in the morning. A dusty dark green Subaru Outback pulled into the gravel lot, parking crookedly next to Frank's gleaming Ford F350. It was a car that screamed function over form, a car that had seen its share of muddy back roads. A woman got out. She was maybe in her late 50s, her graying hair pulled back in a tight no-nonsense bun. She wasn't wearing a blazer or a pantsuit. She was wearing faded Carhartt work pants and scuffed steel-toed boots. She moved with a purpose that was almost terrifying, striding right past the front desk without a glance, her eyes locked on Frank Walker's office. I didn't need to be told. I knew. It was her. The dragon of preservation had arrived. I watched through the glass partition of my little office nook as she entered Frank's domain. She didn't wait to be offered a seat. She walked right up to his big oak desk and placed a single professionally bound document down with a soft but definitive thud. Even from a distance, I recognized it. The simple black cover, the clean white label. It was my report. I saw the color drain from Frank Walker's face. He looked at the document, then up at her, and for the first time since I'd met him, he looked small. Dr. Thorne's voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the building like a diamond blade. "Frank," she said, and it wasn't a suggestion. It was a command. Get your son. Get your foreman. Get your liaison from the town council. I want them all in the main conference room in 2 minutes. Frank just stared, speechless. Now, Frank, she repeated, her voice dropping a half octave, leaving no room for argument. Don't make me ask again. It was like watching a hornet's nest get kicked. Suddenly, the lazy morning erupted into quiet, panicked motion. Frank was on the phone, his voice strained. Caleb was summoned from the site, wiping sweat from his brow, his usual arrogance replaced with a dawning look of dread. Gus was called in, his face grim and knowing. The 2 town council members who oversaw the project were rushed over, looking confused and important. They all filed into the big glass conference room, the one usually reserved for celebrating big contracts. Today, it looked like a holding cell for a firing squad. I, of course, was not invited. I was still at my desk, the invisible girl, with a front row seat to the explosion I had caused. They all sat down, the air thick with tension. Dr. Thorne remained standing at the head of the table. She let the silence stretch out, making them all stew in it. Then she picked up my report, holding it up for everyone to see. Before this meeting officially begins, she said, her voice clear and cold, resonating through the glass, I want to talk about this document. A 30-page structural analysis that was delivered to my office 2 days ago. An analysis that, and I am not exaggerating, single-handedly saved this town a historic landmark and saved your company, Frank, from catastrophic liability. She scanned the room, her eyes like a hawk's, lingering for a brutal moment on Caleb. And then Frank. I have just one question, she continued, her voice dangerously soft. And I expect a straight answer. Who wrote this? The question hung in the room, vibrating with unspoken accusations. From my desk, I watched Caleb's face turn the color of chalk. Frank looked like he'd been punched in the gut. I wasn't in the room, but I could feel the weight of that question land on them. It was a fuse, lit and sizzling, burning its way down the wire to the bomb I had built. And I was the only person in the entire building who knew exactly when it was going to go off. The silence in that conference room was a living thing. It was so complete that from my desk, I could hear the faint buzz of the overhead lights. Dr. Thorne's question, who wrote this, wasn't just hanging in the air. It was sucking all the oxygen out of the room. I watched through the glass as Frank and Caleb Walker looked like 2 fish pulled from the water, their mouths opening and closing without a sound. They were trapped. To admit they didn't know was to admit incompetence. To lie would be to challenge a woman who clearly already knew the answer. It was a perfect trap, and I had built it. Finally, Caleb, sweating under the fluorescent lights, broke the silence. He tried to muster up some of his usual swagger, but it came out weak and strained. Well, Dr. Thorne, he began, clearing his throat. Here at Walker & Sons, we pride ourselves on a collaborative process. It's really a team effort. A lot of us have been burning the midnight oil, looking at the problem from all angles, and this report is really the ... The synergy of that effort. Synergy. He actually used the word synergy. It was the most pathetic, transparent piece of corporate doublespeak I had ever heard. He was trying to take credit for the storm while pretending to be one of the raindrops. Doctor Thorne didn't even blink. Her eyes narrowed, and she cut him off with the precision of a surgeon. Mr. Walker, she said, her voice dangerously calm, don't insult my intelligence. I've been reading structural analyses for 40 years. This report is not synergy. This is the work of a single focused mind with a mastery of finite element. Analysis and material science that is, frankly, breathtaking. This isn't a team effort. This is an artist at work. She held up the report again. So I will ask you one last time, and I advise you to think very carefully before you answer. Who is the artist? That was it. That was my cue. I knew in that moment, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that no one in that room was going to say my name. My moment of truth wasn't going to be given to me. I had to take it. I pushed back my chair, the squeak of its wheels deafening in the quiet office. The two other administrative staff stared at me, their eyes wide. I stood up and began to walk. It was the longest 10 yards of my life. My footsteps on the cheap linoleum floor sounded like drumbeats announcing an execution. I walked past the filing cabinets, past the coffee station, straight towards the glass wall of the conference room. I didn't hesitate. I pushed the heavy door open and stepped inside. Every single head in the room whipped around to face me. The low hum of conversation from the town officials stopped dead. Frank and Caleb stared at me as if I'd just beamed down from another planet. I ignored them. I looked directly at the woman at the head of the table, the one person in the room who mattered. "I wrote it," I said. My voice didn't shake. It was quiet, but it filled the entire room. "My name is Maya Evans," I wrote the report. A new kind of silence fell. A silence of pure, unadulterated shock. Caleb looked like he had seen a ghost. Frank just blinked, his mind clearly unable to process what was happening. But Dr. Thorne's severe, stern face broke, just for a second, into the faintest hint of a smile. It wasn't a warm smile. It was a smile of vindication. "I thought so," she said softly. Then she turned her steely gaze back to the stunned room, and her voice became formal, loud, and clear, like a judge reading a verdict. "Gentlemen," she announced, "you all seem to be confused. Allow me to clarify for you exactly who you have been speaking to." She took a breath, letting the tension build to an unbearable level. "This isn't just Maya Evans, your office assistant." She let that hang in the air. "This is Maya Evans, formerly of my postgraduate research team at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology." A collective gasp went through the room. "She was the lead on my stressed timber project for 2 years. She is also the person who won the National Society of Civil Engineers Student Prize for her paper on non-invasive structural analysis." She paused again, her eyes boring into Frank. 3 years in a row, an achievement no undergraduate had ever managed before, or has since. I personally recommended her for a direct entry PhD fellowship. Dr. Thorne took a step closer to the table, her voice dropping slightly but losing none of its power. "We were all devastated when a family emergency forced her to withdraw from the program. I have spent the better part of 2 years wondering where a mind like that ended up." She let her gaze drift from Frank to Caleb, and then back to me, standing in the doorway. "And now I know," she finished, her voice laced with ice. "It appears she ended up right here at Walker & Sons, filing your paperwork." The bomb had gone off. The fallout was instantaneous and absolute. Caleb physically recoiled in his chair, his face a mask of pure, white-hot terror. The town officials were looking back and forth between me and the Walkers, their expressions morphing from confusion to outrage. "And Frank ... Frank leaned back slowly in his chair, his mouth hanging slightly open. The color had completely drained from his face as he stared at me, the quiet girl he had told to know her place. The pieces were clicking together in his head, with the slow, horrifying sound of a building collapsing. In the back of the room, I saw Gus. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at Caleb, and he was trying and failing to hide a slow, deeply satisfied smile. In the ringing silence, you could feel the entire 75-year history of Walker & Sons construction. Right down the middle, Frank Walker had built his company on solid ground, but he had just discovered its foundation was made of lies. And the only person who could save him now was the woman he had tried to bury. If the silence before the reveal was a vacuum, the silence after was a pressure cooker. It was thick, heavy, and filled with the unspeakable. For a full 10 seconds, The 11 people in that room just stared, frozen in a tableau of disbelief. Me standing in the doorway like a ghost come to haunt them. Caleb slumped in his chair, looking like the air had been sucked from his lungs. And Frank Walker, his face a granite mask of dawning horror. It was Dr. Thorne who finally broke the spell. She gathered her things with a crisp, efficient motion, her authority cutting through the shock. She addressed the pale-faced town officials. First, gentlemen, rest assured the Preservation Society will be taking direct oversight of this project moving forward. The immediate danger has been identified. Then, she turned her attention back to Frank, and her voice was pure steel. Frank, you have 48 hours. I want a new project lead and a revised remediation plan, based page for page on this report, on my desk in Portland by Friday morning. She leaned forward slightly. If I don't get it, I am pulling every permit, and I will personally see to it that Walker and Sons is blacklisted from any state-funded historical contract in Oregon for the next decade. Am I understood? Frank could only manage a slow, stiff nod. And with that, Dr. Thorne turned and walked out, leaving a crater where the Walker family's reputation used to be. The meeting was over. The town officials, suddenly very busy, filed out quickly, muttering amongst themselves and pointedly refusing to look at either Frank or Caleb. Gus was the last of the crew to leave. As he passed me in the doorway, he didn't say a word, but he gave me a single solid nod. It wasn't a nod of pity or surprise. It was a nod of profound, earned respect. And in that moment, it felt better than any apology. The door clicked shut, leaving just the three of us in the room. Me, Caleb, and Frank. Frank didn't move for a long time. He just stared at the report on the table, as if it were a venomous snake. Then, slowly, he lifted his head and looked at his son. He didn't yell. It was so much worse than yelling. His voice was a low, guttural whisper, filled with a cold rage that was terrifying to behold. Caleb, my office, now. Caleb flinched as if he'd been struck. He stumbled to his feet and followed his father out of the conference room like a man walking to the gallows. I stayed where I was, a silent observer to the final act of this family tragedy. I couldn't hear everything through the thick office door, but I didn't need to. I heard Frank's voice, once, a sharp and pained question that cut through the wood. How could you? I heard the heavy thud of something, a book, a paperweight, slamming against his desk. And then, just silence. A terrible, damning silence. 5 minutes later, the door opened and Caleb stumbled out. He was completely broken. The arrogant smirk, the confident swagger, it was all gone. Stripped away to reveal the terrified, inadequate boy underneath. He looked 100 years old. He couldn't look at me. He just walked, shuffling like a zombie, past my desk and out the front door of the company that bore his name, a name he had just dragged through the mud. I watched Frank through the glass wall of his office. He was slumped in his leather chair, staring at an old faded photograph on his desk, a picture of him and his own father, standing proudly on that very same site 40 years ago. He was wrestling with it all, the shame, the betrayal by his own son, and the gut-wrenching, humiliating realization that his entire legacy, everything he and his father had built, was now resting in the hands of the young woman he had dismissed, mocked, and told to know her place. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he stood up. He straightened his shirt, ran a hand through his hair, and walked out of his office. He began the long, lonely walk across the main floor, directly towards my little administrative desk. Every single employee still in the office stopped what they were doing to watch this silent public pilgrimage. It was a walk of shame, and every step must have cost him a piece of his pride. He stopped in front of my desk, the great Frank Walker, looking tired and old and defeated. He couldn't meet my eyes. He just tapped the bound report he was now holding in his hand. This ... he said, his voice hoarse. This is good work. He had to swallow hard before he could continue. I was a fool. An ignorant, proud fool. He finally lifted his head and looked at me, and his eyes were filled with a desperate plea. My father. He loved that mill. It was his white whale. I can't let it die because of ... this. He gestured vaguely towards the door his son had just disappeared through. I need you to run this project, Miss Evans. Not just advise. Run it. The whole damn thing. You will report directly to me and no one else. Name your price, I'll double it. Just ... please. Fix it. He had offered me a job, a salary, a title. It was the vindication I had dreamed of. But as I looked at the broken man in front of me, I wasn't the same quiet girl who had walked in here a month ago, just hoping for a paycheck. I didn't want compensation. I wanted control. And I was about to set my terms. I looked at Frank Walker, this titan of a man, now looking at me with the desperation of a beggar. He had offered me money, a title, anything to make his problem go away. But the girl who had walked into his office seeking a simple job was gone. Burned away in the fire of humiliation. The engineer stood in her place. And an engineer doesn't just patch a problem. She redesigns the entire system. I'll do it, Mr. Walker, I said, my voice steady. But not for double my old salary. And not as a project manager you can overrule. I took a breath. I have 3 conditions. He just nodded, waiting. First, I said, I will be the lead engineer and chief of site operations. My authority on all structural and procedural matters is final. No one overrides my decisions, not even you. His jaw tightened, but he nodded again. Second, you will pay me the top-tier industry salary for a lead engineer with my credentials and experience, retroactive to my first day. This isn't about the money. It's about acknowledging the value you failed to see. He winced, but he nodded a third time. And third, I said, leaning forward slightly. Caleb, Frank's face clouded over. I'll handle my son. No, I said firmly. We'll handle him. He's not fired. Firing him is easy. It lets him run away. He's reassigned to my crew. He'll start tomorrow on deconstruction detail. And his very first job, I said, looking Frank dead in the eye, will be to personally dismantle that steel plate he bolted to the B5 beam. He needs to take apart his own mistake, piece by piece, before he can ever learn how to build something right. Frank stared at me for a long moment, a storm of emotions in his eyes, shock at my audacity, anger, but also a flicker of something else, respect. He saw the hard-won logic, the tough justice in it. He let out a long, slow breath, a sound of complete and utter surrender. Done, he said, his voice raspy. All of it. The project is yours. The next morning, I walked onto the site, not as an office assistant, but as the boss. I called the first morning meeting, and the awkwardness was so thick you could have cut it with a saw. The crew looked at me, then at their boots, then back at me. They didn't know what to make of it. And there, at the back of the group, was Caleb, stripped of his clean work jacket, wearing old, dirty overalls, his face sullen and his eyes empty. I didn't gloat. I didn't even acknowledge the drama. I unrolled my blueprints, the real ones, and I started talking. I laid out the first week's plan, the new safety protocols, the new techniques we'd be using. Gus stood right beside me, a silent, solid presence that told the rest of the crew everything they needed to know. He was with me. And in this world, Gus's endorsement was worth more than Frank Walker's money. It wasn't easy at first. The atmosphere began to change, slowly, like a tide turning. The first big moment came when Caleb, under my direct supervision, used a plasma cutter to slice through the bolts on his disastrous steel plate. The clang of that useless metal hitting the concrete floor was a sound of victory. He never said a word to me, But the act of undoing his own arrogant mistake in front of everyone was a lesson in humility more powerful than any lecture. Then there was Sully, a grizzly old ironworker who'd been with Walker and Sons for 30 years and was skeptical of everything. He questioned my design for a new cross-bracing system. Instead of getting defensive, I walked him through the advanced physics, drawing diagrams in the dust with the toe of my boot. He listened, grunted, and walked away. The next day I heard him yell at a younger worker, "Do it like the chief said. You think you know better than her?" They had started calling me Chief, and it wasn't a joke anymore. The site found a new rhythm, a new energy. It was quieter, more focused. I was there every day, from dawn till dusk, my boots covered in dust. My hands dirty. I wasn't a boss in an office. I was an engineer in the field, and Frank started showing up. Not to give orders, just to watch. He'd stand at the edge of the site for an hour at a time, a thermos of coffee in his hand, just observing. He watched me direct a crane operator. He watched Caleb sullenly hauling away debris. He watched his father's mill being brought back to life, not by a walker, but by the woman he had almost cast aside. One afternoon, he approached me, holding a copy of my report, the pages now filled with his own handwritten notes. "This section here," he said, pointing, "about hydrostatic pressure in the foundation. I don't understand how you accounted for it." It was the first time he had ever asked me a question as a student, not as a superior. It was a small thing, a tiny crack in the dam of his pride, but it was a start. The bones of the old mill were sound after all. It just needed someone who knew how to listen to them. And as the new framework began to rise against the Oregon sky, I realized it wasn't just a building we were restoring. It was the Walker name itself. And maybe, just maybe, it was something inside Frank too. 6 months felt like a lifetime. The day of the old mill's grand reopening was one of those perfect Oregon autumn days, when the air is crisp and the sky is a sharp, brilliant blue. It felt like the whole town of Cedar Creek had turned out. The high school marching band was playing slightly off-key. There were long tables with checkered cloths loaded with lemonade and cookies, and a genuine feeling of community pride buzzed in the air. The mill stood behind the makeshift podium, no longer a skeleton of failure but a masterpiece of restored history. The new glass windows gleamed, and the old timber, now treated and reinforced, glowed with a warm, amber light. It was beautiful. It was strong. And it was finished. After the mayor gave a long-winded speech, he called my name. I stepped up to the microphone, looking out at the sea of familiar faces. I saw Gus in the front row, beaming like a proud father. I saw the whole construction crew, men who now called me Chief with genuine affection. I even saw Caleb, standing quietly at the back of the crowd, looking thinner, humbled, but present. My speech was short. I wasn't there to tell a story of my own victory. "Old buildings are a lot like people," I said, my voice carrying over the crowd. "Sometimes the world looks at them and only sees the cracks, the dust, the years of neglect. It's easy to write them off." I found Frank's eyes in the crowd. "But if you're willing to look closer, you'll find they have good bones. You just have to be quiet enough to listen to the story they have to tell." When I finished, Frank took the stage. Everyone expected him to talk about the Walker legacy, about his father, about the 75 years his family had been building this town. But he didn't. He turned and looked directly at me. "Thank you, Maya," he said into the microphone, his voice thick with an emotion I had never heard from him before. "I'm supposed to stand up here and talk about my family's pride. But pride is what nearly turned this beautiful building into a pile of rubble." The crowd went dead silent. "The truth is," he continued, "this project was failing. It was failing because of me. Because I was too proud to listen and too blind to see the brilliant mind right in front of me." He looked out at the townspeople. His neighbors. "She taught this old dog a new trick. She taught me that true strength isn't always about leading the charge. Sometimes it's about having the wisdom to follow someone with a better map. Maya Evans didn't just save the old mill. She saved Walker and Sons. He paused, then gestured to a large, tarp-covered object on the edge of the stage. And because of that, one last change is in order. Gus and Sully stepped forward and, on Frank's nod, pulled the tarp away. Underneath was a huge, newly carved cedar sign, the lettering deep and clear. It didn't say Walker and Sons. It said, Walker Evans Construction. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, followed by a wave of applause that was genuine and overwhelming. My own breath caught in my throat. I looked over at Frank, who gave me a slow, respectful nod, not as a boss to an employee, but as a partner. It wasn't about revenge. It was never about that. It was about respect. It was about rebuilding something that had been broken. And as I looked at my name, carved in wood next to his, I knew we hadn't just restored a building. We had laid an entirely new foundation, one built not on the shaky ground of pride, but on the solid bedrock of mutual respect. And that was a legacy strong enough to last a lifetime. At its heart, Maya's story isn't just about construction. It's about the blueprints of our own lives and the silent assumptions we build our worlds upon. It's a powerful reminder that a person's true value can't be measured by their job title, their background, or the room others try to put them in. So often, we encounter people like Frank, who judge the cover, or people like Caleb, who try to tear out the pages. This story teaches us that in the face of such injustice, the most powerful response isn't always a loud confrontation, but the quiet, undeniable force of competence and integrity. There's an old saying that fits perfectly here: true gold does not fear the flame. Maya's expertise and character were her gold, and the humiliation and dismissal she faced were the fire. Instead of being consumed, she emerged from it brighter and stronger, proving that substance will always eventually outweigh arrogance. And perhaps just as importantly, Frank's journey shows us that it's never too late to admit you were wrong, to tear down a faulty foundation built on pride, and to rebuild it with the stronger materials of humility and respect. It shows that we truly do reap what we sow. Sow disrespect and you reap failure. Sow humility and you can rebuild a legacy. This story touched us deeply, and it makes us wonder, what did you take away from Maya's journey? Have you ever been in a situation where you felt your true worth was overlooked, only to prove it later on? We would be honored to read your thoughts and stories in the comments below. Your experiences give these lessons real life. If this story resonated with you, please show your support with a like. And be sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our next story of struggle, vindication, and the quiet strength of the human spirit. Until next time, may you find peace in your own journey, and may the foundation you build for yourself be strong, true, and deeply respected. Take care.